Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a deep dive into Tehran's network of allies in the Middle East.
Given Iran's isolation, it became another way of Iran talking to the world.
As Israel steps up hostilities against Iran, we ask, how did we end up here? I'm Natasha del Toro, and this is The Take.
Every single group that Iran has backed would exist independent of Iran, and did exist independent of Iran. What Iran did was look at the regional implications of one of those things getting out of hand and what it would do to them. Everybody else, particularly the Americans and the Israelis, call it meddling. My name is Imran Khan. I'm a senior correspondent with Al Jazeera English, and I'm in Doha right now.
Imran, I'm so happy that you could join us here today. Let's start with sort of who's who in terms of the tensions that have been rising for weeks now in the Middle East. On one side, we have Israel with its ironclad support from the U.S. and other Western support. But on the other side of the chessboard, there's a lot to dig into there. And Iran is a country that always seems to come up. Maybe you could give me a rundown of who is playing alongside Tehran.
So let's take it very, very, very basically. Start with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and some of the Palestinian groups. They are connected to Iran because the Iranians decided that their cause was going to be a just cause, and they wanted to support them, and they gave them military training. They turned them into a fighting force, okay? The same with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah has been set up to be the frontline defense against Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. Then you've got the Houthis, okay? The Houthis are a nationalistic organization who weren't really a thing in Yemen until the Iranians decided that they wanted to back them and develop their military capabilities because they thought that would come in useful at some point for their aspirations. Then you have the pro-Syrian regime groups, the militias in Damascus, who've been facilitated by Iran. That is due to the fact that there was a civil war in Syria and the regime needed fighters. And then you've got the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, who were there to fight ISIL. And the Iranians backed them in that fight because ISIL were an existential threat to Iran as well. ISIL wanted to kill all Shia Muslims. What Iran has done, and very successfully, is it's built a unification between all of those groups. They call it the axis of resistance. Now, this is very, very important because together they're much stronger and they can share information. And it's pretty much like it's NATO in the way that they actually operate. Attack on one is an attack on them all. And Hezbollah and Hamas, we've seen that since October the 7th. So it's not as simple as saying that these groups were created by Tehran. They existed anyway.
Maybe you could take us to the root of why this is happening. Give us kind of an overview about what is the struggle between Israel and Iran about.
The struggle between Israel and Iran is a smokescreen. It is a complete political tool used by the Israelis to deflect from the fact that they do not have a solution to the occupation. They don't want to get rid of the occupation. They want to make the occupation a domestic matter. So every single government since the last 20 years has played up the threat of Iran. Iran is the bogeyman for the Israelis. It allowed the Israelis to basically take off the Palestinian agenda off the table and use words like this is a rogue nation, this is a rogue state. No one was talking about the Palestinian cause before October the 7th. The Oslo Accords had failed. There was no roadmap to a Palestinian state. The Israelis had forced the world to really look at Iran as the enemy, and Iran isn't. The Iranian regime is about the survival of the Iranian regime. It really doesn't want to do anything that's going to threaten that. So the idea that Iran is the enemy is a complete deflection for the Israelis. And it worked up until October the 7th. But now everybody's talking about the Palestinian cause again. There is no security for Israel without a viable Palestinian state. And that is something the capitals of the world are now saying out loud. Perhaps not in Washington, D.C., but certainly in the global south and certainly within Europe.
You know, when we're talking about Israel and Iran, both of these countries can also be seen as isolated, each in their own way. You know, Israel has been investing a lot of effort recently to change its regional isolation through normalization deals like the Abraham Accords. At the same time, Iran is isolated globally. It's been called a pariah state, but, you know, it also has a dense network of these regional allies. Can you tell us about each of these countries' strategies to contain the other?
I mean, that's a very big question. Let's take it step by step. So, firstly, you have the Palestinian issue and Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who, when they started out, were using suicide bombers as their main tactic. It was ineffectual, it didn't really do any justice to the Palestinian cause, and suddenly Hamas's military capabilities go up from suicide bombers to rockets, to missiles. They become a fully trained fighting force. The same thing happens with Hezbollah. You know, Hezbollah during the civil war in Lebanon was a tough fighting force. But so were all of the rest of the factions within Lebanon itself. What the Iranians did was make it much more focused against Israel and southern Lebanon and a bollock to southern Lebanon, and to stop the Israelis from invading and occupying the south, which they've done very, very successfully. You have the Houthis, a force that wasn't really a force to be reckoned with until Iran decided that it was going to back it. The Iranians do have allies, but they also have allies within the globe. Everybody is talking to Tehran. This idea that it's isolated in the world is driven by the Americans and the Israelis. You know, the British still have an embassy in Tehran. You know, the EU have a presence in Tehran. Now, the Israelis don't have that. They don't need it. They've got the backing to the hilt of the Americans and other Western states, particularly France and Germany and the UK. But it's increasingly difficult for Israel and Israelis to justify what they're doing, given the events of October 7th and the fact that there is a genocide going on right now. So the way they're fighting back is to rely on their allies to do the fighting, do the politics for them. And it seems to be backfiring because Israel is much more isolated in this world than it was way before October 7th.
Maybe you could go into a little more detail about what Israel's strategy has been then.
Israel's strategy has been absolutely clear. It's blame Iran for everything and say that it is controlling those groups. And therefore it is the enemy, therefore it needs to be dealt with. And the Israeli strategy right now is to keep pushing Iran to make a strategic blunder which draws America into the region and has to put itself between Israel and Iran. The Israelis want to drag the Americans in, and they've been clear about this. Netanyahu has said this publicly.
America and Israel must stand together. Because when we stand together, something very simple happens. We win, they lose.
The Israeli generals have said this publicly. The only way we survive an attack from Iran is if the Americans fight on our side, and we need them.
And there have also been these sort of normalization deals through the Abraham Accords.
This was Netanyahu pushing for a legacy that was going to go beyond everything else. He was the guy that was going to make peace deals with the Arab countries, and he did it. He did it with the UAE.
Calling it the dawn of a new era, President Trump hosts a signing ceremony for the historic deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates.
The Abraham Accords were being seen as a victory for him, and he was publicly saying, come on, Saudi Arabia, everybody else is doing it, you've got to do it as well. And the Saudis were taking this very seriously. And then October 7th happened, and the Saudis realized that actually they couldn't normalize right now. The normalization backfired because it didn't take into account the occupation. It was too narrow. You need a viable Palestinian state for the world to normalize with Israel.
After the break, how Israel views Iran's strategy. Imran, let's talk for a second about how Israel sees Iran's web of allies. In Israel, there's been a conversation for a while about something called the Octopus Doctrine, and it was coined by former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett.
People don't always understand. Iran is like an octopus. The head is Iran, but it sends about 7 different arms across the Middle East and the world, hitting Israel, but also targeting America. I'll just remind you.
Tell us about this doctrine. What's it all about?
I mean, the Israelis do this. The Israelis have the Hannibal Directive, the Octopus Doctrine. They have this like security language that they use, which sells the threat for them. If you call it something, then people can write about it. It's a great headline, the Octopus Doctrine. Ooh, really scary, octopus got tentacles everywhere. It's this thing that the Israelis do, and they do it very, very well. They do it through the Hasbara, the Israeli public diplomacy ministry that they have. They do it through the language that they use. They do it in every single way that they can. Put very simply, the Octopus Doctrine is that Tehran is the head of the octopus, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. are the tentacles. And therefore, if you're going to deal with Hamas and Hezbollah and the rest of the groups, you have to deal with Tehran. That's the Octopus Doctrine. It's not taken very seriously outside of the US and in Israel.
How did Israel get to this point where it sees itself surrounded by what's a so-called ring of fire?
I mean, that's the occupation. Hezbollah wouldn't exist if Israel didn't invade southern Lebanon and occupy it for a very long time. Hamas wouldn't exist if the occupation went away tomorrow. If it wasn't for the occupation of the Golan Heights, those Syrian groups wouldn't exist. Israel wouldn't have the enemies that it has. And that is something the Israelis really do not like talking about. What they say is, we're under attack.
On July 31st, we saw Israel do something almost unprecedented. It hit Iranian soil directly.
The political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, we're getting reports, has been killed in Iran. That's according to statements from Hamas and Iran's Revolutionary Guard.
The stakes are really high here. What could we see moving forward?
Well, firstly, I think that's the wrong question. I think the right question is, what did Israel get out of killing Ismail Haniyeh? Ismail Haniyeh was the one guy that wanted a ceasefire and was in the negotiations and really pushing for a ceasefire and really pushing to get the rest of Hamas in line. He was the senior lead negotiator. What did Israel get out of killing him? What they got out of killing him was a delay to the ceasefire, which is what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu is waiting. He's waiting to see what happens in November in the US elections.
And let me ask you, we don't want to fearmonger here, but there are a lot of headlines that talk about that we're closer than ever to, a major regional conflict. You're somebody that's been covering the region for a very long time. From where you're sitting, what do you see happening?
Two things. Firstly, the Iranians have a get-out clause right now about their response on Israeli soil. It's the ceasefire. If all the parties agree to a ceasefire, then Iran can legitimately say it was the threat of us responding that forced the parties to the table to come up with a ceasefire. And that way, they don't have to respond. And that is a very smart play for the Iranians. The second one, and this is the nightmare scenario, and I don't want to alarm people, but when you have a nuclear-armed Israel and a weaponized with massive conventional weaponry Iran, and they're on a war footing, mistakes can happen. All it's going to take is civilians being caught up, Israeli or Iranian, who die en masse because a rocket didn't go to a military base, it went to a village somewhere in Iran or a village somewhere in Israel, and then suddenly all bets are off. So, cooler heads have prevailed in the past. Their response was measured by the Iranians.
The Israelis have confirmed that at least 100 drones were fired by the Iranians from Iranian territory. They were anticipating these types of drones coming in anywhere, reports indicated, from 2 to 10 hours. So it still looks like
it was a response from Iranian sovereign territory to Israeli territory, but it was so well telegraphed, we knew it was happening hours before it happened. I was there, I watched the missiles come in Jerusalem. We knew it was happening. We could see it. It was in front of us. But when countries are geared up for a war footing, mistakes can happen and mistakes will lead to war.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Marcos Bartolomé and Veronique Eshaya, with Shraddha Joshi, Tamara Khandaker, Manahil Naveed, Hagir Saleh, and me, Natasha del Toro, in for Malika Bilal. The Take production team is Amy Walters, Ashish Malhotra, Catherine Nouhan, Chloe K. Lee, Duha Mosaad, Hagir Saleh, Khaled Soltan, Manahil Naveed, Marcos Bartolomé, Noor Wazwaz, Sari el-Khalili, Shraddha Joshi, Sonia Bagat, Tamara Khandaker, and Veronique Eshaya. I'm your host, Natasha del Toro. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexander Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.